Ancient Egypt is not just one of the oldest civilizations. It is a phenomenon in human history whose stability and duration of rule have evoked both admiration and bewilderment. For more than 3 millennia, successive dynasties of pharaohs maintained seemingly unshakable power over millions of subjects, controlling vast territories along the Nile. Their dominion was perceived as something natural and preordained, and their will as a law that has no equal. But how did they do it? The answer lies not only in the obvious aspects of power, such as military might, labor organization, or an efficient economy based on the Nile floods. Much deeper, on a psychological level, the pharaohs were masters of manipulation and mind control. They designed and implemented a complex, multifaceted system that appealed to the deepest fears, aspirations, and beliefs of the Egyptians, shaping their worldview and behavior. This system permeated every thread of the social fabric, from the sacred rituals performed in the great temples to the everyday conversations in the humble mud huts. The pharaohs did not simply demand obedience. They sought to create a mental space in which any resistance, or even the thought of it, was absolutely unthinkable. They transformed themselves from a simple ruler into a living god, making every aspect of their power part of a sacred, immutable order. Every Egyptian, from the farmer toiling in the fields to the high priest in the temple, was involved in this system, which worked tirelessly to strengthen the ruler's power. The goal was not just outward obedience, but a deep-seated internal acceptance of this hierarchy, with the pharaoh at the pinnacle of existence and each subject in his humble but necessary place. Let's look at these 6 psychological techniques in detail, each powerful on its own, but together creating a virtually impenetrable bastion of power that allowed the pharaohs to keep the people in a constant state of awe, fear, and unquestioning obedience. The first, and perhaps most fundamental, pervasive, and psychologically powerful instrument of control used by the pharaohs was their absolute deification. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler chosen by the gods or their representative on earth. He was himself considered a living god incarnate on earth. This concept was not a metaphor, not a poetic simile, but the cornerstone of all Egyptian theology, state ideology, and everyday worldview. Egyptians, from the uneducated peasant to the high priest, believed it literally. The pharaoh was not simply a man invested with power. He was a direct descendant of the gods, and even more, an incarnation of the god Horus, the falcon god, patron of kingship, son of Osiris and Isis, the central figures of the Egyptian pantheon. In addition, he was often associated with the sun god Ra, or Amun-Ra, the supreme demiurge, creator of the world and all living beings, symbolizing his life-giving force and all-encompassing power. This connection with the most powerful deities gave his figure a truly cosmic significance. From the moment of his birth and throughout his life, the pharaoh carefully constructed this divine image. His birth was surrounded by myths of divine conception, where the supreme god himself, for example Amun, came to the queen so that she would bear him an heir. This made the pharaoh's birth not just a royal event, but a sacred one, predestined from above, which excluded any doubts about his legitimacy. His deeds, be it the grandiose construction of temples and monuments, brilliant military campaigns, effective administrative reforms, or wise legislative acts, were always attributed to divine inspiration and infallible wisdom given to him directly by the gods. Thus, any decision of his was perceived as a manifestation of the highest divine will, and not as a simple human decree. His death was not considered the end of existence, but only a solemn transition to another world, to immortality among other gods, from where he continued to care for Egypt, joining the host of his divine ancestors. The pharaoh was the only link between the world of men and the world of the gods. Only he could communicate directly with the divine beings, perform the necessary rituals for them, and ensure their favor for all of Egypt. If the Nile flooded on time, bringing fertile silt and ensuring a rich harvest, this was attributed to the successful prayers and rituals of the pharaoh, his personal intervention, and the favor of the gods. If crop failures, droughts, epidemics, or other disasters occurred, this could be interpreted as a manifestation of his anger, caused by the disobedience of the people, or as a sign that the people did not revere their divine ruler enough, which caused general horror, repentance, and a desire to atone for guilt in order to return his favor. The cult of the pharaoh permeated every aspect of Egyptian life. The numerous priests, a powerful, well-organized, and extremely influential caste, possessing enormous knowledge and wealth, were the main vehicles for communicating this idea to the masses. They did not simply preach, they lived out this belief on a daily basis through complex rituals, hymns, litanies, ceremonies, and observances that were regularly performed in thousands of temples throughout Egypt. Each temple, each local cult, had its own connection with the divinity of the pharaoh, whether through offerings in his name, praising him as the patron of a particular deity, or using his name in prayer. In temple reliefs, tombs, and stelae, the pharaoh was invariably depicted surrounded by the gods, conversing with them as equals, receiving gifts and symbols of power from them, or making offerings to them, often even depicted as surpassing the gods in size and importance of the figures. These images served as a constant visual reminder of his unique, incomparable status, which could not be disputed because it was imprinted in stone. Thus, any disobedience to the pharaoh was not simply a political act or a crime against the state. It was an act of sacrilege, an insult to the gods, and a violation of the cosmic order known as Ma'at, universal harmony, justice, and truth. It carried not only earthly punishment, which could be extremely cruel, but also something far worse: eternal damnation, the loss of the opportunity to enter the afterlife, the destruction of the soul, or a terrifying, endless existence in chaos after death. The fear of divine wrath was far greater than the fear of earthly authorities, for it touched on the deepest existential fears of each person about his or her eternal destiny. This absolute belief in the divinity of the pharaoh made his figure inviolable, and his will a law beyond question or criticism. It ensured not just external loyalty, but also a deep internal acceptance of this power, a complete absence of any organized or even individual resistance, since who would dare to rebel against a living god? It was a brilliant psychological device that transformed political power into a religious imperative, making it invulnerable to criticism and challenges, ensuring amazing continuity and stability in the governance of a huge empire over the course of millennia. It formed not just external submission, but also a deep-rooted internal acceptance of his power as the only possible, correct, and divinely established one. For the ancient Egyptians, life on earth was merely a fleeting stage, a kind of prelude to a far more important, eternal, and unlimited existence in the afterlife. The concept of the afterlife was central to their worldview, permeating every aspect of their culture, art, architecture, and daily activities. This belief was not just dogma, it shaped their life goals and ethical principles. And it was here that the pharaoh wielded another powerful psychological lever. He was not just the guarantor of prosperity in this life, but more importantly, the key to the gates of eternity and the guarantor of well-being in the afterlife. The path to the afterlife was considered difficult, dangerous, and full of invisible obstacles. The soul of the deceased, consisting of various components, Ka, Ba, Ah, Ren, Shuit, etc., had to go through many trials, overcome mythical monsters, interrogate the gods, and be weighed on the scales of justice of Osiris, the lord of the afterlife. On these scales, the heart of the deceased was compared with the feather of Ma'at, a symbol of truth, order, and justice. Only those who were pure, whose heart was lighter than the feather, that is, not burdened with sins, could hope for a blissful existence in the fields of Ialu, the Egyptian analogue of the heavenly fields, where life was abundant and happy. Those whose hearts were heavier could be swallowed up by the terrible monster Amit, which meant the final destruction of the soul and oblivion. It was the pharaoh who was considered the main intermediary between humanity and the gods of the afterlife. He possessed sacred knowledge, unique magical abilities, and divine favor, necessary to ensure a safe passage to Duat, the afterlife, for himself, and ultimately for his subjects. His favor could influence the outcome of the afterlife, and his prayers and rituals were necessary so that the souls of the Egyptians could safely pass all the tests. The most obvious and material manifestation of this control was mummification and burial rituals. The process of mummification was extremely complex, labor-intensive, incredibly expensive, and required a deep knowledge of anatomy, chemistry, and, most importantly, sacred rituals. Ideally, every Egyptian aspired to complete mummification so that his body would be preserved as a home for his Ka, life force, double, and Br, soul, embodiment of personality, which were to return to the body after wanderings in the afterlife. Without a preserved body, the ka and ba could not exist, and the soul was doomed. However, access to complete high-quality mummification, expensive burial objects, such as ushabti, servants in the afterlife, amulets, magical scrolls with spells from the Book of the Dead, and luxurious tombs was strictly limited. The common people could only count on primitive forms of embalming, if they could afford them at all, and sometimes on natural drying in the hot desert sands. Only the highest nobility, officials, and those who enjoyed the special favor of the pharaoh could afford all the necessary attributes for a prosperous afterlife. The opportunity to be buried next to the pharaoh or to receive part of his grave goods was considered a great honor and a guarantee of a safe passage, since proximity to the divine ruler extended his protection to them as well. The belief was that the pharaoh's favor during life and after death could guarantee a favorable outcome in the afterlife. Serving the pharaoh, unquestioningly fulfilling his will, loyalty, strict adherence to the laws established by him, and participating in the construction of his monuments were considered the highest virtues that could be counted in the afterlife. Conversely, disobedience, rebellion, showing disrespect to the pharaoh, or violating his established order could lead to horrific consequences. The soul could be destroyed by the soul-eater Amit, deprived of the opportunity to resurrect, or subjected to eternal torment and oblivion in the darkness of Duat. Imagine the existential horror when your eternal, endless fate, your place in the cosmos, depends on your earthly behavior in relation to one person, who is also a living God. This created an incredibly powerful incentive for lifelong and even posthumous obedience. The pharaohs also controlled sacred texts and knowledge related to the afterlife. The Book of the Dead was not just one book, but a vast collection of spells, hymns, and instructions designed to help the deceased in the afterlife. Copies of it could be extremely expensive, and its contents were complex and demanding of interpretation, making the priests and the pharaoh the sole authorities on its interpretation. The pharaoh and the priests determined what information would be disseminated and what would remain secret. This gave them a monopoly on the truth about the afterlife, making them indispensable intermediaries. They could interpret omens, predict the future, or pretend to predict, and explain the will of the gods, always in a way that supported their own authority and reinforced the idea of the need for obedience. They were the keepers of the keys to eternity, and this monopoly gave them unimaginable power over the minds and souls of the Egyptians. Thus, the pharaoh was not just an earthly ruler, but a kind of master of destinies, both in this life and in the next. This powerful psychological strategy, appealing to the most fundamental human fear, the fear of death and oblivion, as well as the hope for eternal existence, ensured the almost unconditional submission of the people. The afterlife was not just a belief, it was an effective instrument of control that permeated every thought and action of the Egyptian, guaranteeing his loyalty to the pharaoh until death and even after it. Because even in the grave he continued to serve his divine ruler in the hope of eternal bliss. The third, visually most striking and stunning psychological device of the pharaohs was the use of monumental architecture and omnipresent symbols of power. Pyramids, majestic temples, colossal statues, obelisks, sphinxes, all these colossal structures were not just architectural masterpieces, tombs, or places of worship. They were carefully designed as powerful instruments of psychological influence, designed to suppress the will of the people, instill awe before the absolute power of the pharaoh, and constantly tirelessly remind of his unearthly greatness and immortal strength. Imagine the daily life of a simple Egyptian, be it a farmer working on the banks of the Nile, a craftsman in the city, or a slave in the quarries. Every day he saw these gigantic structures dominating the landscape, towering over everything human. The pyramids, for example, towering over the horizon of the desert, seemed to be the creations not of human hands, but of divine hands, erected by an unknown, incomprehensible force. Their grandiose scale, the geometric precision of their construction, the incredible amount of labor expended, tens if not hundreds of thousands of workers, many of whom died during construction from accidents, diseases, and exhaustion, all this could not fail to amaze the imagination and inspire the deepest awe. These monuments were tangible, irrefutable, eternal proof of the unlimited power of the pharaoh. His ability to mobilize countless human and material resources, organize gigantic masses of people, and control millions of lives to achieve his goals, which seemed superhuman. They silently but extremely convincingly said, if the pharaoh is able to build this structure, unthinkable in scale and labor costs, then his power is truly limitless, and it is useless to resist him. These structures symbolize not only the power of the ruler, but also his eternity, his desire to perpetuate his name and his dominion over time and space. On the walls of temples, in tombs, on obelisks and steles everywhere, images of the pharaoh were carved and painted. He was often depicted in divine poses, conversing with the gods on an equal footing, receiving gifts and symbols of power from them, leading the gods in procession, or most importantly, defeating Egypt's enemies, alone or with divine help, trampling them underfoot, crushing them with his mace. These reliefs and paintings were not just art, but a kind of constant, all-pervasive visual propaganda, reinforcing the image of the pharaoh as an invincible, omnipotent and godlike ruler, the guarantor of security and order. They constantly reminded the people of his greatness, his ability to protect the country, and provided visual confirmation of his divine status. The lack of widespread literacy among the vast majority of the population made these visual symbols even more effective, as they were accessible and understandable to absolutely everyone, regardless of their level of education. The iconography was carefully crafted to evoke specific emotions: fear of the pharaoh's enemies, awe of his wisdom and strength, pride in their country being led by such a divine leader, and a sense of security under his hand. In addition to architecture, the symbols of royal power themselves played a colossal sacred role. The double crown, Shent, which combined the white crown of Upper Egypt, Hedshet, and the red crown of Lower Egypt, Deshret, symbolized his absolute dominion over the entire united country and its unity under his leadership. The scepter, Heket, and the whip, Nehaha, are not just symbols but attributes of power, justice, the ability to both punish and encourage, lead and direct the people. The false beard worn by the pharaoh was a symbol of his connection with Osiris, the god of the underworld and of his general divinity. The uraeus, the sacred cobra depicted on his headdress, served as a symbol of protection from enemies and his destructive power against those who dared to oppose him. Every element of the pharaoh's attire, every static pose, every carefully considered gesture was sacralized and loaded with deep symbolic meaning, emphasizing his uniqueness, his separation from mortals, and his role as a living god. When the people saw the pharaoh dressed in these regalia, it not only strengthened his image as a ruler, but also inspired a deep, sacred fear of the living God who possessed all these attributes and could use them at his own discretion. Thus, monumental architecture and royal symbols created an atmosphere of constant, all-pervasive psychological pressure and suppression. They formed the feeling that the pharaoh was something more than just a man. He was a powerful, unshakable, eternal force, before which any individual was insignificant and powerless. This constant visual contact with the manifestations of his boundless power suppressed any thoughts of resistance, instilling a feeling of hopelessness and absolute submission. These structures were not just a historical legacy, they were an active, permanent instrument of maintaining fear, awe, and absolute submission throughout the life of every Egyptian, reminding them of their humble place in the hierarchy and of the immutability of the divine order, of which the pharaoh was the center. The sight of these gigantic structures, built at the cost of incredible effort, served as a silent but compelling warning of what the pharaoh could do to those who dared to challenge his will. A fourth psychological device that the pharaohs used with astonishing skill was the regular performance of grand public rituals and ceremonies. These events were not simply religious rites or state holidays. They were carefully staged, highly effective theatrical performances designed to reinforce the pharaoh's authority, his divine status, and to cement the unity of the nation under his unquestioned leadership. They were powerful instruments of mass suggestion that drew huge crowds from all over Egypt and had a profound emotional and psychological impact on the people, strengthening their loyalty and fear. Examples of such ceremonies were the annual celebrations of the Nile flood, on which the survival of the entire country depended, because the Nile was not just a river, but a source of fertility, life, and prosperity. The pharaoh personally participated in complex and ancient rituals designed to ensure the god's favor for the flood, and then its successful implementation and the subsequent rich harvest were presented as direct evidence of his divine power and ability to influence the elements of nature. Thus, the pharaoh became not just a ruler, but a guarantor of the very existence of life. Likewise, the coronation ceremonies, which included elaborate rites for the transfer of divine power and royalty to the new ruler, the Jubilees of Reign, called Heb Sedi, which celebrated the 30th year of the pharaoh's reign and were intended to symbolically confirm his eternal vitality, wisdom, and ability to govern the country for a new period. Military parades demonstrating the organized might of the Egyptian army, led by the pharaoh himself as supreme commander, and the solemn processions with images of the gods, where the pharaoh always occupied the central leading place, personally carrying the sacred symbols or following them. All these were not just celebrations, but demonstrations of power, divine legitimacy, and the inviolable cosmic order. During such events, the pharaoh appeared before the people in full royal splendor, dressed in sacred regalia, surrounded by a large retinue of priests, high officials, military leaders, and his personal guard. His robes, inlaid with precious stones and gold, his jewelry, amulets, symbolic objects, everything was intended to emphasize his exclusivity, his divine nature, and separation from ordinary mortals. The atmosphere of the ceremonies was electrified. Solemn music played, trumpets, harps, drums, ancient hymns and litanies in honor of the gods and the pharaoh were performed. Incense was burned, symbolic sacrifices and complex ritual actions took place, understandable only to the initiated, but impressive to everyone. All this created a feeling of a sacred action, grandiose, incomprehensible and all-encompassing, in which the pharaoh was the main character, the only mediator between people and gods. The people, witnessing these spectacles, felt themselves part of something much greater than themselves, something transcendent and divine. This reinforced the sense of community and belonging to a great civilization, headed by a divine ruler. Mass rituals had a powerful unifying effect, erasing individuality and dissolving it in collective awe, ecstatic submission, and a common sense of devotion. In a crowd, a person lost his criticality. His emotions were enhanced by the collective experience, and he completely submitted to the general emotional wave, reinforced by the presence of the living God and his powerful retinue. Crowd psychology was fully utilized to suppress any individual doubts. These ceremonies also served to demonstrate the wealth and power of the state, personified by the pharaoh. Majestic processions, luxurious decoration, perfect discipline of troops, and a large number of officials. All this emphasized the inviolability of his power and inspired fear of any attempts to undermine it. Disobedience or rebellion seemed unthinkable against the background of such a demonstration of organized force, enormous wealth, and obvious divine support, which seemed to protect the pharaoh from any adversity. Moreover, the successful performance of rituals, especially those related to fertility, the well-being of the country, and protection from enemies, confirmed the legitimacy of the pharaoh and his effectiveness. If the Nile overflowed on time and generously, the harvest was good and the country prospered. This was direct evidence that the pharaoh was correctly fulfilling his divine duties and maintaining harmony, Ma'at, in the world. Failures could be explained by the wrath of the gods due to the people's lack of diligence, violation of rituals, or manifestations of discontent, which further increased the fear of the pharaoh and his ability to punish through divine mediation, placing the blame on the subjects themselves. Thus, public rituals were not only a spectacle, but also a powerful mechanism of psychological control, constantly confirming and strengthening the absolute power of the pharaoh over the minds and hearts of his subjects, turning him into the only possible and saving ruler without alternative. The fifth method, unlike the previous ones, was more pragmatic, harsh, and directly related to earthly coercion, but no less effective. A developed system of espionage and extremely severe demonstrative punishments. Despite all the divinity and religious propaganda, the general awe and suggestion, the pharaohs understood perfectly well that to maintain absolute order, a tangible physical fear of inevitable earthly retribution was also necessary. They did not rely solely on faith, but created a ramified and ruthless system of suppression of any potential dissent or resistance, which worked in parallel with religious and symbolic methods. The ancient Egyptian state had an extremely complex and extensive bureaucracy and administrative apparatus, which extended from the central authority in the capital, e.g. Memphis or Thebes, to the most remote villages, provinces, and military garrisons. Within this system, there existed a tacit but effective network of informers and informers. These people, often local officials, scribes, work supervisors, priests, military commanders, merchants, or even ordinary citizens, secretly reported any manifestation of discontent, seditious talk, suspicious meetings, attempted plots, or even simply disloyal remarks uttered in private conversation. No one could feel completely safe, since any neighbor, co-worker, market trader, or even relative could be the ears and eyes of the pharaoh. This created an atmosphere of constant tension, mistrust, and paranoia in society, forcing people to carefully weigh every word and every action, even in the circle of family or close friends. In such an environment, self-censorship became not just desirable, but a vital norm of behavior. Fear of an unknown informer was one of the most powerful psychological tools. Punishments for disobedience, rebellion, conspiracy, treason, or even simple disrespect for the pharaoh, such as blasphemy against his name, were extremely cruel and unambiguous. The degree of cruelty varied depending on the severity of the crime and the social status of the offender, but was always aimed at serving as a terrifying example to others, instilling terror and discouraging any desire for similar actions. Public executions were particularly effective. They were carried out in the central squares of cities, in front of temples or other significant places, gathering huge crowds of people who were often forced to attend. The sight of the suffering and agonizing death of a disobedient person was meant to serve as a visual, blood-curdling lesson and to imprint in the minds of every Egyptian the idea of the inevitability, and cruelty of punishment for the slightest disobedience. Executions were often accompanied by official announcements of the crime and its severity, so that no one would doubt the validity of the punishment and the absolute rightness of the pharaoh. This was a powerful means of suppressing any potential rebellion in the bud. Moreover, punishments could extend to the criminal's family. Children could be enslaved, property confiscated, and relatives deprived of rights, exiled or persecuted, branded as traitors. This aspect created an additional powerful incentive for obedience. A person had to think not only about his own personal fate, but also about the fate of his loved ones, whom he could condemn to suffering through his disobedience or even a careless word or thought. Thus, the system of espionage and severe exemplary punishments created a constant, tangible fear on the earthly physical level. It complemented the religious fear of divine wrath, making the power of the pharaoh absolutely all-pervasive, inexorable, and inevitable. Even if any of his subjects could theoretically doubt his divinity, which would have been very rare, he could not help but fear the earthly, physical, and social consequences of disobedience. This combination of invisible control and visible cruelty was extremely effective in suppressing any signs of resistance before they could develop into a real threat to the pharaoh's absolute power, creating a society permeated with fear and submission, where every move and every word was controlled. The sixth, but extremely subtle, far-sighted and penetrating psychological device that the pharaohs used with unprecedented effectiveness was the strict and comprehensive control over education and all information circulating in Egyptian society. The pharaohs and their inner circle, including the powerful and intellectually superior priestly caste and numerous scribes, understood the fundamental truth. Knowledge is power, and ignorance is an instrument of control. By manipulating access to information and its content, they not only controlled the behavior of their subjects, but actually shaped their worldview, their picture of the world, making them absolutely dependent on the official version of reality and eliminating any possibility for independent thinking, critical analysis, or even a shadow of doubt in the legitimacy and divinity of the pharaoh's power. This was an indirect, but the most powerful way to achieve long-term and complete submission. Education in ancient Egypt was not a universal right or available to all classes of the population. On the contrary, it was a rare and extremely valuable privilege, a kind of pass to the highest spheres of society, accessible only to a very select few. These select few included the sons of the nobility and high officials, future priests, the numerous scribes necessary for the functioning of the huge bureaucratic machine of the state, as well as some highly skilled artisans, sculptors, painters, architects, engineers, whose unique skills were vital for the implementation of grandiose state projects, such as the construction of monuments and temples. Schools were often located at temples, administrative centers, for example, houses of life, or directly at the palaces of the pharaoh, which guaranteed not only their centralized control, but also the direct, constant ideological influence of the authorities on the developing minds of students from a very early age. The curricula were carefully developed and strictly regulated in such a way as not only to teach basic skills, the study of the most complex hieroglyphs, simpler hieratic and demotic, numeracy, the basics of astronomy, geometry, geography and administration, but also, which was much more important, to instill the correct from the point of view of the pharaoh and the ruling elite, ideas, values and worldview. From an early age, students were instilled with the principles of absolute loyalty to the state, unquestioning obedience to the pharaoh as a living god, and deep reverence for the gods and the entire established order. They were taught that serving the pharaoh was the highest good and the path to prosperity. Special central attention was given to the study and interpretation of history, mythology, and religious texts. Historical chronicles and annals were constantly rewritten, edited, and interpreted in such a way as to always, without exception, glorify the ruling dynasty and each individual pharaoh. His military victories, even minor skirmishes or border conflicts, were exaggerated to epic proportions, turning him into an invincible conqueror. Failures, defeats, periods of political weakness, internal unrest or economic crises were hushed up, downplayed or attributed exclusively to external forces, the machinations of enemies or divine displeasure, but never, under any circumstances, to the fault of the pharaoh. The pharaoh himself was always depicted as the embodiment of wisdom, justice, power, piety, and godlikeness, acting solely for the good of all of Egypt and the entire cosmos. Any information about unrest, internal conflicts, popular revolts, slave rebellions, or periods of weak, unpopular rulers, and especially about the fall of dynasties or civil wars, were carefully erased from official chronicles. Papyri, inscriptions on the walls of temples and tombs, or distorted beyond recognition so as not to leave a trace in the collective memory. Thus, the people formed not just a distorted, but a completely idealized and absolutely uncritical picture of the world and history, where the power of the pharaoh was always legitimate, unchanging, eternal, and absolutely beneficial, and any resistance was not just meaningless, but also a sacrilegious, sinful act that ran counter to the cosmic order. The control over information was comprehensive and multifaceted, embracing both written and oral forms. The priests, as the guardians of ancient texts, sacred knowledge, rituals and traditions, played a key role in this process. They had a monopoly on sacred texts, including various versions of the Book of the Dead, ritual papyri, and astrological tables. They decided which scrolls would be copied and distributed among a limited circle of initiates, which myths would be passed down from generation to generation, and in which only correct interpretation, and which would be forgotten, changed, or even physically destroyed in accordance with the current political line and ideological needs. Only those versions of events, teachings, and religious dogmas that strengthened the authority of the pharaoh, supported the existing order, and cultivated unquestioning obedience were disseminated. Any information that might undermine the ruler's credibility, sow the slightest doubt about his divinity, cause discontent among the population, or stimulate critical, independent thinking was strictly suppressed. This concerned not only official written sources, which were inaccessible to the vast majority of the population, but also oral traditions, folk songs, proverbs, riddles, and legends that might carry any charge of free-thinking, satire, or criticism of authority. Stories about heroes who rebelled against injustice, or about the times of chaos before the establishment of royal power, were either distorted or became taboo, so as not to provide the people with role models or reasons to consider the possibility of an alternative order. The illiteracy of the vast majority of the population was another key factor that played into the hands of the pharaohs and strengthened their control. The common people, unable to read or write, were completely dependent on the priests, scribes, and officials for any information, be it religious dogmas, news from the capital, decrees of the pharaoh, or explanations of current events. For example, the causes of drought, crop failure, or successful flooding of the Nile. They were presented with simplified but ideologically verified versions of myths and events that always emphasized the power of the pharaoh and the need for unquestioning obedience to him, as the only guarantee of stability, order, and prosperity. This created a kind of information bubble or ideological dome within which the only correct point of view was considered to be that of the pharaoh and his entourage, and alternative opinions, concepts, historical facts, or critical interpretations simply did not exist in the public consciousness. People could not compare information from different sources, analyze it, draw their own conclusions, or question the official version, since they had no access to other sources or tools for critical thinking. It was a total information blockade. This total, multi-level control over information and education ensured that the people would not only not have access to ideas that could cause rebellion or doubt the legitimacy of power, but would also be sincerely, deeply, and unquestionably convinced of the righteousness, absolute power, and divine mission of their ruler. It was a subtle but incredibly effective way to keep minds under control, forming a worldview in which the pharaoh was the undisputed center of the universe, and his power was the natural, unchanging, eternal, and blessed order of things, the guarantee of the existence of all Egypt. This method ensured loyalty not so much through direct coercion and physical violence, but through the formation of the very way of thinking and perception of reality, creating a society in which each citizen was, in essence, a self-controlled part of a huge state mechanism, acting according to the single will of the pharaoh. It was an ingenious system of indoctrination that ensured mental slavery along with physical slavery. So we see that the rule of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt was not simply the result of military might, economic prosperity, or favorable geographic location. It was a masterly, multifaceted, and astonishingly effective manifestation of the art of psychological control that permeated absolutely every aspect of society, from its very foundation to everyday rituals and the most personal, secret beliefs of each person. The pharaohs created a complex, multi-layered, and deeply integrated system that effectively combined religious authority, earthly cruelty, grand visual symbols, public spectacle, total information control, and consciousness shaping. They masterfully exploited the deepest human fears: fear of death, eternal oblivion, divine wrath, hunger, loss of loved ones, chaos, and the strongest hopes for eternal life, prosperity, stability, and protection in this world and the next. From the absolute deification of the ruler's personality and the monopoly on the afterlife, to the construction of colossal monuments symbolizing infinite and inhuman power. From the organization of lavish, stunning public ceremonies that exploit crowd psychology, to the introduction of an all-pervasive system of espionage and severe exemplary punishments, and finally to the strict and total control of education and any information that shapes thought. Each of these techniques has been carefully thought out, honed and implemented over thousands of years. Together they created an atmosphere not just of outward submission, but of absolute awe, overwhelming fear, and the deepest, most sincere respect, which virtually excluded any possibility of resistance or even the slightest dissent. The people were not simply subject to force, they were psychologically, mentally, and spiritually shaped for unquestioning obedience. Their mentality was imbued with the idea that the pharaoh was not just a king, but the center of their world, their savior, their guide to eternity, and the only guarantor of order, Ma'at, without which terrible and destructive chaos would ensue. The millennia of remarkable stability and unprecedented continuity of power in ancient Egypt are vivid and irrefutable evidence of the phenomenal effectiveness of these psychological strategies. They clearly show how power can be strengthened not only by force of arms, direct coercion, and economic pressure, but also in much more subtle, penetrating but no less powerful ways, through the manipulation of consciousness, the formation of beliefs, the exploitation of people's fears and hopes. The lessons of ancient Egypt remain relevant today, reminding us of the importance of critically examining information, questioning authority, understanding the hidden mechanisms of power, and valuing freedom of thought and access to diverse sources of knowledge to avoid similar forms of control and manipulation in any society. The pharaohs left behind not only magnificent pyramids, gigantic temples, and priceless artifacts. They left a profound, instructive mark on the history of human interaction, demonstrating the limits of human subjugation and the incredible ingenuity of those who seek absolute, all-encompassing power over minds and bodies. Their methods have become a kind of ancient textbook on mass control, and their influence, albeit in completely different forms and contexts, can unfortunately be seen even in the modern world, where information technology provides even more opportunities for shaping public opinion and behavior.